Facebook collected, stored, and sold the behavioral data of 2,200,000,000 people without any of them knowing exactly what was being sold. Not names, not emails. It was the complete map of what makes you buy, vote, believe, and give up. There's a story that tech schools don't tell about how the world's largest companies stopped selling products and started selling predictions about human beings, about how your next click, your next pause while scrolling the feed, your next like will be monetized before you even make them, and about how this didn't happen by accident. It was built with industrial precision, exactly the way you build an oil refinery. Because the comparison isn't metaphorical, it's structural. When John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil dominated the 20th century, it didn't dominate crude oil, it dominated refining. Raw oil coming out of the ground was worth very little. What had value was the process that transformed it into fuel, kerosene, plastic, into power. Today, the raw data you generate when you wake up and check your phone is worth almost nothing. What has value is the algorithm that refines it, and the owners of that refinery are building the greatest accumulation of economic power the world has ever seen. What no one has stopped to ask yet is, who gave permission for us to be refined? If this kind of story interests you, about how power moves before anyone notices, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, do you think you know what big tech does with your data? In the early 2000s, the internet was a different kind of promise. The dominant business model was still the oldest in the world. You sell a product, the customer pays, the transaction ends. Amazon sold books. Google sold simple advertising space based on keywords. Facebook didn't even exist yet. And nobody, not a single executive, investor, or regulator, had the vocabulary to describe what was about to happen. The change began with a crisis. In 2001, the dot-com bubble burst. Tech companies worth billions on paper turned to dust in months. What remained was an unanswered question. How does a digital company actually make money? Product didn't work. Subscriptions didn't scale. And it was in that vacuum that an answer emerged that would change everything. What if the company sold nothing to the user, but sold the user to the market? Not as a person, as a behavioral pattern. The conceptual shift was described years later by academic Shoshana Zuboff in her book she called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Zuboff identified the exact moment when Google stopped being a search tool and became a behavioral data extraction machine. It was 2002. Google was beginning to realize that the data generated by users' searches, what people typed, how they rephrased their questions, how long they took to click, was more valuable than any information the users were actually looking for. It was a faithful portrait of the interior of the human mind. Doubts, fears, desires, intentions. And that portrait could be sold. The product was no longer the search. The product was you, but the raw product still needed refining, and that's where the algorithm entered the scene. Not as a tool, but as a refinery. Think about how an oil refinery works. Crude oil arrives through a pipeline, mixed, impure, practically useless in its original form. The refinery applies processes of distillation, separation, and recombination. What comes out the other side are specific, high-precision products for specific markets. Aviation fuel, diesel, gasoline, polymers, each one with different value for different buyers. The algorithm does exactly that with human behavior. You access a platform. Every move you make generates raw data. Where your eyes stop on the screen, tracked. How much time you spend on each type of content. What you skip, how fast you scroll the feed when you're bored versus when you're anxious. What combinations of words make you click. What time of day you're most impulsive. The raw data is voluminous, chaotic, seemingly meaningless. The algorithm then distills it, separates the patterns. identifies correlations that the human brain could never process, and recombines all of it into something of the highest value, a prediction. Not a vague prediction, a precise prediction that you will click on this ad at this moment, that you will engage with this content for 30 more seconds, that you are in an emotional state that makes you 23% more likely to make an impulse purchase. That's what gets sold, not the data, the prediction. And just like the colonial commodities, sugar, rubber, indigo, that we've explored in other episodes of this channel, the value wasn't in the raw resource. It was in the processing system that controlled it. Whoever controlled the refinery controlled everything. But what nobody had noticed yet at that moment was that there was a physical limit in the whole process, a bottleneck that would define who would win the race. The scarcest resource wasn't the data, it was attention. Think of it this way. Oil exists in limited quantities. Copper exists in limited quantities. But behavioral data is theoretically infinite. Every click generates more data. The real limitation is something else. For data to have value, the user needs to be on the platform. To be on the platform, the user needs to pay attention to it. And attention is an absolutely finite resource. Every human being has 24 hours a day, 8 hours of sleep, hours of work, eating, commuting. What's left is fought over ferociously by every app, every platform, every notification. This created a new kind of market. Not a market for products, a market for minutes of human life. In 2016, Google executive Tristan Harris, who would later found the Center for Humane Technology, internally described what the platforms were doing with a term the industry loved and then came to hate: attention capture. Every interface design feature, every decision about the number of notifications, every choice about how to organize the feed was being optimized for a single metric: session time. The more time users spent on the platform, the more data was generated, the more predictions were sold, the more money came in. And the most efficient method discovered for keeping a human being glued to a screen wasn't showing them what was interesting. It was showing them what was emotionally disturbing. Rage, fear, outrage, emotions that neuroscientists call high arousal, keep the brain alert and ready to react. A post that makes you angry produces 3 times more engagement than a post that makes you happy. And engagement, in the logic of the refinery, is the highest quality data. The system wasn't built to make you angry. It was built to maximize session time. Anger was the most efficient byproduct that A/B testing found. And once the data showed that result, the algorithm was adjusted to amplify it. Not because someone decided that anger was good, because anger worked. And what happened next exceeded any projection the engineers themselves had made. Between 2012 and 2017, the global average time spent on social media increased by 142%. Facebook went from 800 million users to 2,200 million. YouTube became the second largest search engine on the planet. Instagram was bought by Facebook for $1 billion, a figure that seemed absurd in 2012, and today looks like one of the greatest purchases in corporate history. And the attention economy, which 5 years earlier had been an academic concept, became the foundation of an industry now worth more than $500 billion a year. But the power of the refinery didn't stay contained within the advertising market. And that's where the story shifted from a business story to a story about political power. In 2013, Edward Snowden revealed that the NSA, the United States Security Agency, had built mass surveillance programs using exactly the same data collection infrastructures that big tech had developed. PRISM, the most famous of these programs, had direct access to servers at Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. Not through hacking, through cooperation. The behavioral data refinery and the apparatus of the world's most powerful state security operation ran on the same raw material, and the companies that collected it were at the center of everything. This was no coincidence. It was the logic of monopoly expressing itself on a geopolitical scale. But there was an even more disturbing dimension that Snowden didn't reveal, because it was purely commercial. In 2015, a company called Cambridge Analytica signed a contract with Ted Cruz's presidential campaign. The service offered was apparently simple: electoral micro-targeting, identifying undecided voters, and delivering personalized messages to them. What wasn't in the contract was how Cambridge Analytica had built its database. A researcher named Alexander Kogan had developed a quiz app on Facebook. Innocent, the kind that tells you which TV show character you'd be. 870,000 people installed the app. But the terms of service at the time allowed the app to collect not only the data of whoever installed it, but the data of all of that person's Facebook friends. The result? 870,000 users generated the psychological profile of 87 million people. 87 million people who never clicked on anything, who never consented to anything, who simply existed as a connection of someone who had taken a quiz about which Game of Thrones character they'd be. That was sold to political campaigns in 3 different countries. The question that arose then, and that to this day has not been answered satisfactorily, was, if this was possible within existing rules, what was happening beyond public reach? The answer came in pieces, distributed over the following years through whistleblowers, journalistic investigations, and congressional testimony that produced more confusion than answers. Frances Haugen, a former Facebook product engineer, delivered to the U.S. Congress in 2021 internal documents that became known as the Facebook Files. What the documents showed was simple and devastating. The company knew, through its own research, that Instagram caused harm to the mental health of teenagers, especially girls. It knew that the content distribution algorithm amplified misinformation because misinformation generated more engagement. It knew that extremist groups were using its platforms to recruit and organize. And it chose, systematically, not to change the algorithm because changing it would reduce session time. And here lies the irony that defines this historical moment. The same mechanism Rockefeller used to consolidate Standard Oil's monopoly is operating today, but with a fundamental difference that makes it far harder to regulate. When Standard Oil monopolized oil refining, there was an identifiable physical asset: the pipelines, the refineries, the storage tanks. The American government could point to them, could measure them, could order them broken into smaller pieces. And in 1911, the Supreme Court did exactly that. But how do you break up an algorithm? The asset that Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple have accumulated isn't physical. It's a data advantage. The longer the platform exists, the more data it has, the more precise its predictions become, the more valuable it is to advertisers, the harder it becomes for any competitor to enter the market. It's a self-reinforcing monopoly in a way that no 20th century antitrust law was designed to combat. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice filed an antitrust case against Google. In 2021, the FTC attempted the same with Facebook. Both cases drag through the courts to this day, with uncertain outcomes, while the companies keep growing. The European Union tried a different approach. The General Data Protection Regulation, the famous GDPR, came into force in 2018. The California Consumer Privacy Act followed in 2020. In Brazil, the General Data Protection Law was signed in the same year. On paper, these are robust frameworks. In practice, the fines applied to date represent fractions of a percentage point of the profits of the affected companies. In 2023, Meta was fined €1.2 billion by Ireland, the largest fine under the GDPR at that point. Meta recorded revenue of $116 billion that same year. The refinery kept operating. And this is where the story of big tech converges with every story we've told on this channel. The East India Company governed 300 million Indians with a private army because the British state had no infrastructure to do what it did. United Fruit controlled 6 Central American republics because local governments needed the railroads it had built. Corporate power doesn't impose itself through brute force. It imposes itself by becoming infrastructure, so essential, so embedded in the daily functioning of society, that removing it seems more dangerous than keeping it. Google processes 8,500 million searches per day. It is the planet's cognitive infrastructure. WhatsApp is the primary means of communication for 2 billion people. Apple's payment system processes trillions of dollars in transactions. AWS, Amazon's cloud infrastructure, hosts the data of governments, hospitals, and central banks in more than 40 countries. You can't simply switch that off, and the companies know it. The question that remains is the one that has always remained in every episode of this channel, in every monopoly story humanity has ever lived through. At what point does the power of a private corporation stop being a business story and become a matter of sovereignty? When the East India Company began minting its own currency, the British Parliament finally understood there was a problem. When Standard Oil controlled more than 90% of American refining, Theodore Roosevelt understood there was a problem. In both cases, intervention came late, after the structural damage was already done, after the concentration of power had already reshaped society around itself. Today, 4 companies, Google, Meta, Amazon, and Apple, control the digital infrastructure of more than half of humanity. They determine which information is seen and by whom, which businesses survive and which get swallowed, which politicians can reach their voters and at what cost. And they do it through a system of extraction and refinement of human behavior that most people who use it daily cannot accurately describe. This isn't conspiracy. It's the logical structure of surveillance capitalism operating exactly as it was designed to operate. The difference between oil and behavioral data is one thing, and it's unsettling. Oil runs out. Human behavior, as long as there are humans, never ends. Every generation has its own versions of the East India Company. The names change. The mechanism, identify an essential resource, build the extraction infrastructure before governments notice, and then become too indispensable to be removed. That mechanism doesn't change. If you want to keep understanding how that mechanism works, how it repeats itself, and where it's operating right now, subscribe to the channel. Every episode is a piece of the same puzzle. Give it a like if this connection between oil and data made you see your screen differently. And tell me in the comments, which company today do you think has already crossed the line between corporation and government?